All right, the topic for this video is genetic resistance to pathogens. And genetic resistance really just means that a person has inherited genetic traits that make them better at resisting infection than a person normally would be. And it's different than an immune response, right? We're not using phagocytosis necessarily. We're not using antibodies. B cells and T cells don't need to be involved. It really means that through some other mechanism, the pathogen doesn't recognize the host the way that it should. Okay, so common examples of this. Remember, viruses have to attach to human cells by binding surface proteins. If a person has genetic variants or mutations in those surface proteins, the virus can attach as easily. We'll see an example of this in a little bit with HIV that makes some people resistant to HIV infection. There are also variations in proteins sometimes where that protein is the target for bacterial toxins. That can make the toxin less effective. Okay? And so since these things are inherited genetically from your parents, there's no immune response necessary. And I say that natural selection is in effect, which just means that people that have these variations or mutations are going to be better at surviving infection. And a lot of times those variations spread in the population because, right, they give an advantage. Okay? And so we don't really have to even fight off the infection in some of these cases, or it's at least easier to fight off. So let's look at some specific examples. All right. The HIV mutation that I mentioned before is in a gene called CCR5, and CCR5 is a co-receptor to the CD4 receptor that HIV directly recognizes. And what ends up happening is some people have a deletion in the CCR5 gene. This is showing the gene sequence. These are the single letter abbreviations for the amino acids that make up that protein. And there is a section of that gene that's removed, making the receptor non-functional. And so when HIV tries to bind to CD4 receptor to get in those helper T cells that it infects, can't get in. And so for these people, which are relatively rare, right? We're talking about, if you look at this frequency map, even in places that are the most concentrated, these hotspots, 0.13 is telling you that 13% of people in that area have at least one copy of the mutation. So if they get exposed to HIV, they will not get infected because the virus just does not have the ability to get in their cells and cause an infection. Right? Now, why did this mutation spread throughout parts of Europe when HIV is a relatively new disease? There's some evidence that the mutation originally was protective against smallpox, and smallpox isn't around anymore, but HIV has some proteins with similar enough structure that it might give protection against that as well. Okay, so this explains the geographic distribution because smallpox was the most devastating in Europe and Western Asia. And so that's where we see the mutation showing up in populations because it gave them an advantage at some point in time. All right. Example number 2, malaria. This is a classic example of natural selection in humans. And the idea is the sickle cell allele, right, the one that causes sickle cell anemia in the hemoglobin gene, can give protection against malaria. Interestingly, it doesn't make so the person can't be infected by Plasmodium is the pathogen that causes malaria. So the infection can still happen, but if you have that sickle cell allele, you're only about 10% as likely to die as someone who doesn't have any sickle cell alleles, right? So the mechanism looks something like this. This is fluorescent staining of human red blood cells. The blue over here is the cell membrane of those red blood cells. And these bluish colored particles, those are bits and pieces of Plasmodium, right? That's the pathogen causing the infection. And then the yellow strands that you're seeing are actin cytoskeleton inside the cell. So it's kind of cool. The Plasmodium normally uses those actin filaments as a way to move itself back towards the cell membrane. And remember, Plasmodium causes horrible symptoms in malaria by making red blood cells rupture and burst. And so it has to get to the membrane in order for that to happen. In somebody with sickle cell, the actin filaments are disrupted. They're really short, and the plasmodium has a very hard time latching onto them, and so it can't as effectively get to the cell membrane, which means it's bad at causing red blood cell rupture. Okay? And so this is, in the end, kind of a sad case because malaria is horrible, sickle cell is horrible, and so what we're really just saying is, apparently, in an evolutionary sense, malaria was worse than having sickle cell, which is why this allele became widespread in Central African populations, which are areas where malaria was endemic, and to this day still causes horrible, horrible problems in the population. All right. Okay, example number 3, prion protein. This is one of my favorites. My doctoral research involved prion proteins in Alzheimer's disease. In this case, we're talking about a disease called Kuru, and in Kuru, there is a gene that encodes something that we just call prion protein that spreads throughout the brain. And if you aren't familiar with prions, there should be another video in this playlist going through the basics of how prions function, but they're basically contagious proteins. And what this research group found was there is a single amino acid mutation, right? G127V is just telling you that in that prion protein, amino acid number 127 is supposed to be a glycine, but it gets mutated to a valine. That one amino acid change, and the people are resistant to Kuru. They can't get it. Right? And so in all of these examples, what I'm hoping you see is they all involve something that's not really directly an immune response. It's not that they're better at fighting off the pathogen, or the bacterium or the virus. It's that they're better at not getting it in the first place, or at least not having the infection be as severe. Okay. All right, so if you're following along in the playlist, the next video after this will start to discuss adaptive immune responses, right? B cells, T cells, and producing antibodies to mount an adaptive immune response. So follow the playlist, subscribe to the channel, and watch the videos in series so they'll all make a bit more sense that way.